He built skyscrapers that touched the sky, but couldn't see his own home crumbling beneath him. On his son's 10th birthday, while his child waited for him, he was buying diamonds for another woman, and when he finally returns, a single candle burns unlit, a tiny river stone left in silence. What he doesn't know is that the wish it carries is for him. How far would you go to rebuild a family you almost destroyed? Hi everyone, I'm Selena from Heartwoven Tales, and I hope you're doing really well today. I'm curious, where are you listening to me from? Drop it in the comments, I'd love to know. Today, I've created a story that will take you on an emotional journey filled with love, regret, and hope. Trust me, you'll want to watch every single moment till the very end because every twist will keep your heart racing. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story from us. All right, let's dive in. Zariq Vane stood in his private studio long after the city outside had softened into distant murmurs, the glass walls reflecting a man who looked successful from every angle and yet strangely unfinished, his reflection fractured by drafting tables, rolled blueprints, and steel models of towers that climbed arrogantly toward ceilings that could not contain them. The air smelled of graphite dust, aged paper, and burnt coffee, a familiar mixture that clung to his clothes the way responsibility once clung to his name. And as his fingers moved steadily across vellum, drawing lines with unwavering confidence, his breathing remained even, controlled, practiced, as if nothing in his life had slipped beyond calculation. He adjusted the angle of a lamp, the light sharpening edges, revealing precision, revealing certainty, the kind of certainty that never asked whether something should exist, only whether it could. Somewhere beyond the closed door, the house continued its quiet rhythm, not alive with noise, not entirely silent either, but filled with the soft, overlooked sounds of a family accustomed to being background scenery. A clock ticked with maddening patience, its sound stretching into the corners of the hallway, while the faint scent of baked chocolate lingered, warm and sweet, slowly cooling, slowly being forgotten. Zariq did not notice it. He had learned, over time, how to narrow his world until only what demanded him remained inside it. His phone vibrated against the table, a subtle interruption, one he welcomed without realizing it, because the vibration did not carry obligation or disappointment, only anticipation. When he glanced down, the screen lit his face, smoothing the tension from his brow before he could stop himself, and the message waiting there felt lighter than anything inside his own walls. Sloane's name glowed brightly, followed by words that felt alive, impatient, teasing, promising an escape from repetition and routine, promising a version of himself that didn't have to explain why he was tired all the time. He typed quickly, erased, typed again, his fingers moving with more care than they had when Mira had asked him earlier that evening if he planned to be home before dinner. At the time, he had answered without lifting his eyes, a sound rather than a sentence, a habit he barely registered anymore. Behind him, footsteps stopped. Mira stood in the doorway, barefoot against the cool floor, a thin cardigan wrapped around her shoulders, her hair loosely tied back, stray strands framing a face that had learned how to wait without hope. Her hands carried no sketchpad now, no pressed leaves, no pencils. They rested empty at her sides, as if she had set something down and forgotten where. The faint aroma of jasmine followed her in, the same scent she had worn since the early years, when Zariq used to bury his face into her neck and say it calmed him. Tonight, it passed unnoticed. "Leo's asking for you," she said, her voice steady, not pleading, not accusing, simply stating a fact she already knew would change nothing. Zariq didn't turn, his eyes still fixed on the blueprint in front of him, a building designed for thousands, spaces meant for people he would never meet. People whose lives mattered to him more abstractly than the two waiting just a room away. "I'm busy," he replied, as if the word itself explained everything. "He knows," Mira said quietly. "He still wants you." The clock ticked louder, or maybe Zariq had simply run out of ways to ignore it. He rubbed his temple, irritation flickering across his face, not because of guilt, but because of interruption. "It's late," he said. "He should be in bed." Mira took a step forward, then stopped, as if crossing the threshold required more energy than she had left. "It's his birthday," she said. That made him turn, slowly, annoyance tightening his jaw. "I didn't forget." Her eyes held his, searching, measuring, finding only distance. "Then why does it feel like you did?" The question lingered between them, unanswered, because from the kitchen came the soft scrape of a chair and the sound of small sneakers tapping nervously against wood. A child trying not to be impatient, a child trying to be good. "He's waiting," Mira said again, and this time she didn't wait for a response before walking away. Zariq stood alone, staring at the place where she had been, his phone vibrating again in his pocket, reminding him there was somewhere else he could be, someone else who did not look at him as if he were already gone. After a moment, he exhaled sharply, grabbed his jacket, and followed. The kitchen lights were dimmed, warm but subdued, casting soft shadows across a small celebration that felt fragile, as if one wrong movement could shatter it. The cake sat untouched at the center of the table, chocolate frosting beginning to dull as it cooled. 10 candles arranged with care, their wicks pristine, unburned. Leo sat straight-backed in his chair, legs swinging under the table, hands folded tightly together in his lap, wearing a paper crown that tilted slightly to one side, the edges uneven where he had cut it himself. When he saw Zariq, his face brightened instantly, relief rushing in before excitement, as if he had been holding his breath without realizing it. "Dad," he said, the word soft but full, as though it still meant something precious. Zariq forced a smile, one he had perfected in boardrooms and presentations. "Hey," he said, already glancing at his watch. "Happy birthday." Leo nodded eagerly, sliding the crown straighter. "Mom said you'd come." Mira stood near the counter, arms crossed loosely, watching them with a stillness that felt heavy. "You can light the candles," Leo said quickly, afraid of wasting time, afraid the moment might disappear if he didn't grab it. Zariq reached for the lighter, hesitated as his phone vibrated again, then flicked it open. The flames jumped, small and hopeful, casting tiny reflections in Leo's eyes. "Make a wish," Zariq said, distracted, already half elsewhere. Leo leaned forward, closed his eyes, his lips moving silently. He didn't blow the candles out. He waited. Zariq frowned. "You forgot something." Leo looked up. "I was waiting for you to stay." The words landed awkwardly, not dramatic, not loud, just honest, and something in Zariq tightened, discomfort crawling up his spine. He straightened, checking his phone once more, Sloane's message lighting the screen with impatience wrapped in charm. "I can't tonight," he said, standing. "I have to go." Mira's voice cut in, sharper now. "Zariq." "I'm doing this for us," he snapped, already moving toward the door. Leo slid off his chair, small feet rushing across the floor, and held out his hand. Inside, his palm rested a smooth river stone, cool and gray, worn perfectly by water and time. "I got you something," Leo said, breathless. "I walked all the way to the river. It's special." Zariq glanced at it, recognition failing to register. "That's nice," he said, gently closing Leo's fingers around it. "Keep it safe." He didn't see the way Leo's shoulders sagged, didn't hear Mira's quiet intake of breath, didn't notice the candles still burning, untouched by a wish that had never been spoken aloud. The door closed behind him, sealing warmth inside and leaving absence in its place. Hours later, the house greeted him with darkness and stillness. He flicked on the kitchen light and froze only briefly at the sight of a single candle, standing alone on the counter. Unlit now, its wick untouched. A tiny river stone placed carefully beside it, deliberate, patient, waiting. Zariq stepped over it without a thought, keys dropping into the bowl, shoes kicked aside, his mind already drifting toward tomorrow, unaware that the candle had never been meant for him at all, but for a wish a 10-year-old boy had made alone, in a kitchen that had already begun learning how to exist without its father. Morning arrived without announcing itself. No light laughter drifting down the hallway, no muted clink of ceramic as Mira set her teacup beside the sink, no electronic chirps or muffled explosions from Leo's video game leaking under his bedroom door. Zariq woke slowly, the way one does after a night that ended without closure, his eyes opening to a ceiling that felt too high, too blank, his chest rising once, twice, before he realized something was wrong. The silence pressed against his ears, not peaceful, not calm, but dense, unnatural, as if the house itself had stopped breathing. He lay still for a moment, listening harder, waiting for the familiar cues that usually told him he was already late to someone else's life. But nothing came. Not footsteps, not water running, not the soft hum Mira always made when she moved through the kitchen, half awake. He sat up slowly, the sheets cool and undisturbed beside him, Mira's side already neat, already erased, and for the first time a thin thread of unease slid under his skin. He swung his legs over the bed, the wooden floor cold beneath his feet, and stood there longer than necessary, staring at the closed bedroom door as if it might explain itself if he waited long enough. It didn't. The clock on the wall ticked, sharp and isolated, each second stretching wider than the last, and he found himself irritated by it, annoyed that even time seemed to be moving without asking him. Down the hallway, the house looked staged, like a show home meant to be admired but never lived in. No school bag slumped against the wall, no discarded sneakers kicked off in haste, no faint smell of toast or bread lingering in the air. The kitchen greeted him with order, the counters wiped clean, the sink empty, the chairs pushed in with care. It felt wrong, like walking into a place that had already decided he was no longer a part of its routine. Zariq frowned, his annoyance sharpening because inconvenience was something he understood better than absence. He moved to the fridge, pulled it open, scanning shelves automatically, and that was when he saw it. A single sheet of paper held in place by a small magnet shaped like a leaf, Mira's handwriting unmistakable even before he read the words. The letters were neat, evenly spaced, not rushed, not emotional, as if she had taken her time, as if this was something she wanted to be clear. "We found the silence you sought. We hope you enjoy it." That was all. No accusations, no explanations, no demands. Zariq scoffed softly, the sound too loud in the empty kitchen, and pulled the note free, reading it again as if another meaning might reveal itself if he stared long enough. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, folding it once, then twice, irritation buzzing in his chest. He dropped it on the counter, already framing it in his mind as a dramatic gesture, a temporary protest meant to shake him, to make a point, something that would resolve itself by evening. Mira had always needed time when she was hurt. Leo would be bored by noon. They'd be back. He poured himself coffee, the machine gurgling and hissing too loudly, the smell sharp and bitter without Mira's bread to soften it, and carried the mug into the living room, settling onto the couch with his phone in hand. Messages from work flooded the screen, schedules, confirmations, a reminder of a meeting he'd almost forgotten, and for a while he let himself sink into that familiar current, the one that required nothing from him except focus. Minutes passed, then more. The coffee cooled untouched on the table. The silence didn't fade. It grew. By late morning, it had started to feel intentional, like a presence that followed him from room to room. He paced the house, opening doors he didn't need to open, glancing into spaces he usually ignored. Mira's illustration desk stood exactly as she had left it, pencils aligned, pressed leaves labeled carefully in thin handwriting, her sketchbook closed, waiting. He ran his fingers over the edge of the table, dust-free, unused, and felt a flicker of something that wasn't quite worry, not yet, but wasn't annoyance either. Noon came and went without interruption. The sun shifted, light sliding across the floor in long, slow patterns, and still the house remained untouched, unmoved, unchanged. Zariq's phone stayed quiet. No missed calls, no messages asking when he'd be home, no reminder to pick up milk or Leo's favorite juice. He checked the screen more often than he meant to, his thumb hovering, then lowering, again and again. By afternoon, the quiet had settled into his bones, heavy and cold, and the realization crept in slowly, unwillingly, that this wasn't a pause. This wasn't a performance. The house felt less like it was waiting, and more like it had already accepted something he hadn't. Zariq stood in the hallway staring at Leo's closed bedroom door, his hand suspended inches from the knob, hesitating for reasons he didn't want to name. When he finally pushed the door open, the room greeted him with an order that didn't belong to a 10-year-old boy. The bed was made tight, corners tucked with precision, the shelves cleared, the floor bare. No scattered stones, no half-finished projects, no smell of crayons or dust or childhood. It looked preserved, like a memory sealed behind glass. His eyes moved automatically to the closet. The door hung slightly open. Inside, empty hangers lined the rod, evenly spaced, swinging gently as if disturbed recently. The space where Leo's bright shirts and hoodies once hung now hollow and pale, a faint outline left behind where color used to be. Zariq's throat tightened, his breath catching without permission, and he stepped closer as if proximity could undo what he was seeing. On the bed, centered on the bare pillow, lay a small piece of paper, folded carefully, deliberately. He picked it up with unsteady fingers and opened it slowly, revealing a simple drawing, a child's hand rendering of a father and son standing side by side, their hands touching, both smiling too widely, the lines uneven but earnest. Zariq stared at it, the silence roaring in his ears now, louder than any argument had ever been, louder than any accusation Mira could have thrown at him. And for the first time that day, the truth pressed in hard enough to make his chest ache. They hadn't stepped out. They had left. They hadn't stepped out. They had left. That realization did not explode inside Zariq the way movies often suggested such truths should. It settled instead, slow and invasive, like damp creeping into the foundation of a building no one bothered to inspect. He moved through the following days with deliberate efficiency, answering emails, returning calls, accepting congratulations on projects that now felt oddly distant, all while refusing to linger on the image of Leo's empty closet or the folded drawing resting on a pillow that no longer smelled like a child's shampoo. Every instinct in him pushed toward motion, toward replacement, toward noise, because stillness was dangerous, and silence had already proven it could swallow him whole if he let it. That was how Sloane came to occupy the house so quickly, not through careful discussion or shared grief, but through momentum. One evening, she arrived with a suitcase that looked too polished for the wooden floor it rested on, its wheels clicking sharply as she rolled it inside, her presence instantly altering the acoustics of the space. Her voice carried easily through the rooms, bright and confident, touching walls that had grown accustomed to softer tones. Zariq told himself he felt relief when she unpacked, when the house no longer echoed every footstep back at him, when her perfume replaced the lingering absence of jasmine and baked bread. He told himself this was proof that life moved forward, whether one was ready or not. Yet from the first night, the house resisted her in ways neither of them named. The air felt different when Sloane slept beside him, warmer but unfamiliar. Her breathing out of sync with his, her weight occupying space Mira had once filled so naturally it had felt permanent. Zariq lay awake longer than usual, staring at the ceiling, listening not to the comfort of another body, but to the uneven rhythm of someone who did not know the history of this place. Someone who did not instinctively reach for him in the dark the way Mira used to after a bad dream she never spoke about. Sloane, practical and decisive, began rearranging almost immediately, her energy restless, purposeful, as though the house were an extension of the gallery she curated so expertly. She noticed the plants first, the dozens of small potted greens lining windowsills, corners, shelves, each one carefully tended, leaves wiped clean weekly, soil loosened gently by hands that understood patience. She stood in the living room one afternoon, sunlight cutting across her face, and gestured dismissively. She said they made the space feel crowded, dusty, old. She laughed lightly when she said it, as if erasing them were a favor. Zariq watched silently as boxes appeared, watched as greenery disappeared into cardboard, the rooms growing brighter and more sterile, with every plant removed. He told himself the sharpness in his chest was nostalgia, nothing more. When Sloane discovered Leo's drawings, the last one Zariq had failed to throw away himself, she barely paused. She flipped through them quickly, colorful pages flashing past her fingers, then stacked them neatly as if tidying clutter rather than handling evidence of a child who had once filled the house with noise and motion. She said something about starting fresh, about clean lines and open spaces, words that normally comforted Zariq, words he had built a career on, yet hearing them now felt oddly disorienting. He nodded anyway because questioning her would require him to explain why those crooked drawings still mattered, and he wasn't ready to admit that to himself. As the days blurred together, Zariq found his attention drifting toward absence rather than presence. He noticed details he had ignored for years, spaces that now seemed to demand acknowledgement. The rug near the window bore a faint, stubborn indentation where Leo's beanbag chair had rested, the fibers pressed down in the shape of a childhood that refused to fully vanish. No matter how often Sloane vacuumed, the outline remained, a quiet reminder that something had once belonged there. Zariq caught himself standing over it more than once, his foot hovering, unsure whether stepping into the space would erase it or make it worse. In the kitchen, his eyes were drawn repeatedly to a specific corner of the counter, a spot that now gleamed under artificial light. Mira used to leave notes there, sometimes reminders, sometimes nothing at all, scraps of paper with quick sketches of leaves or a single word written in looping handwriting. The surface was empty now, aggressively clean, yet Zariq's gaze returned to it unconsciously, waiting for something that never appeared. He would reach for his coffee and pause, a faint expectation tugging at him, then shake his head as if annoyed at his own distraction. Evenings grew louder with Sloane's presence. She filled the silence with television shows, music, phone calls taken on speaker, laughter that rose suddenly and sharply, ricocheting off walls that had learned to absorb quieter sounds. Zariq sat beside her on the couch, her legs draped comfortably over his lap, her fingers idly tracing patterns on his arm, and tried to relax into the simplicity of it. This was supposed to be ease. This was supposed to be freedom from obligation, from disappointment, from the constant feeling of failing someone no matter how hard he worked. Yet the house had its own memory and it refused to be overwritten so easily. One night, as Sloane laughed at a joke on the screen, a sound slipped through the room that made Zariq's body react before his mind could rationalize it. It was soft, barely there, the faint rustle of paper brushing against paper, the exact sound Mira's sketchpad used to make when she turned a page carefully. Unwilling to smudge her work, his hand tightened against the couch cushion, his heart skipping in a way that felt involuntary. Without thinking, he muted the television, the sudden quiet making Sloane turn toward him with an amused frown. "What?" she asked. "Didn't you hear that?" he replied, his voice lower than intended. She listened for a moment, then shook her head. She told him he was imagining things, smiled, reached for the remote. Zariq didn't argue, but he didn't relax either, his gaze drifting down the hallway, searching shadows for a source he knew didn't exist. Then came the smell. It drifted through the air gently, almost kindly, the faint sweetness of berries, so familiar it hurt. Leo's juice, the one Mira always bought even though it stained everything, the one Leo drank too fast, leaving sticky rings on the table. Zariq inhaled slowly, his chest tightening, the scent pulling memories forward with quiet insistence. He stood abruptly, murmured an excuse he didn't finish, and walked away, moving through the house as though following something just out of reach. The rooms offered no answers. They stood empty, watchful, filled with echoes rather than sound, and as Zariq paused in the hallway, surrounded by closed doors and erased lives, a thought settled into him with chilling clarity, heavier than anything he had allowed himself to consider before. Was he truly free, or had he simply exchanged one kind of prison for another, this one built carefully, deliberately from his own choices? 4. The question did not leave him when the house finally went quiet again. It followed Zariq into the early hours of the morning, pressed itself between his shoulder blades as he dressed for work, lingered in the mirror where his reflection looked sharper somehow, more rigid, as though even his face had begun to forget how to soften. Was he free, or had he simply rebuilt the same confinement with different materials? He dismissed the thought the way he dismissed most discomforts, by burying it beneath routine, but it resurfaced the moment he stepped into his office, where the familiar smell of paper, ink, and polished wood no longer settled his nerves the way it once had. The drafting table stood in neat rows, models of future buildings gleaming under bright lights, but when Zariq spread his latest blueprints across the table, something felt wrong. The lines were precise, the proportions flawless, the calculations exact, yet as he studied the design, his chest remained unmoved. There was no quiet satisfaction, no subtle excitement, only a sterile correctness that felt strangely hollow. He adjusted a few measurements, redrew a curve, darkened a line, but the discomfort persisted, a low hum beneath his focus that refused to quiet. The first comment came during a preliminary review, spoken gently but with hesitation. A junior associate cleared his throat, eyes flicking between the blueprint and Zariq's face, and said the design felt impressive but distant, like something admired from afar rather than lived in. Zariq waved it off, attributing the remark to inexperience, yet the words lingered, echoing uncomfortably as the day unfolded. Another colleague mentioned the structure felt imposing. A consultant noted the absence of communal warmth. Each observation landed lightly on its own, but together they formed a pattern Zariq could no longer ignore. By the time the client meeting began, tension sat tight in his jaw. The boardroom was filled with polite smiles and restrained impatience, the kind of atmosphere that preceded praise or destruction. And as Zariq presented his vision, he spoke with the same confidence that had carried him through countless approvals. He highlighted scale, innovation, efficiency, sustainability. He spoke of skyline impact and architectural legacy. When he finished, silence followed, heavier than applause ever was. The client leaned back, fingers steepled, eyes narrowing as he studied the plans laid out before him. "It's impressive," the man said slowly, and Zariq felt a flicker of relief before the word, but arrived. "It's also cold." Zariq stiffened. "Cold? There's no warmth here," the client continued, frustration creeping into his voice. "No life. Where do people exist in this space? Where do they gather? Where do they feel at home?" Zariq opened his mouth to respond, but the words didn't come easily. He glanced down at the blueprint, suddenly seeing it through unfamiliar eyes, and for the first time noticed how rigid it looked, how unyielding. The client's patience snapped. He shoved the papers back across the table, the sound sharp and final. "Where is the life in this design, Mr. Vane?" The question hit harder than it should have. Zariq managed to recover, to smooth the meeting into something resembling professionalism. But as he left the room, his confidence felt brittle, cracked. The elevator ride down was silent, his reflection staring back at him from mirrored walls, and for the first time in years, doubt followed him out of the building instead of staying behind. As the day wore on, memories surfaced uninvited. Mira, standing beside his desk late at night, tilting her head as she studied his work, pointing out how a window could catch morning light better if shifted slightly, how a hallway needed softness, not symmetry. Because people didn't move in straight lines when they were tired or distracted or happy. He remembered brushing off her suggestions sometimes, smiling indulgently, but more often than not, he had listened, had redrawn, had felt the design improve in ways he couldn't articulate. Sloane never did that. She praised scale, height, impact. She admired ambition, not comfort. Zariq realized with a jolt that no one had asked him about livability in months because no one around him valued it anymore, and he hadn't noticed until it was gone. That night, the house greeted him with echoing quiet. Sloane wasn't home yet, and for once the absence didn't bring relief. Zariq moved through rooms that felt too large, too empty, his footsteps sounding intrusive, as though he were trespassing in his own life. He poured himself a drink he didn't want, sat for a moment he didn't enjoy, then stood again, restless, drawn toward the hallway almost against his will. His hand brushed against a cabinet door he rarely opened. It creaked softly as he pulled it ajar, revealing shelves filled with things forgotten by choice, rather than accident. He knelt, shifting boxes aside until his fingers touched something familiar, something worn, a photo album, old, heavy. Its cover faded at the edges. He hesitated before opening it. Inside, time waited patiently. Pages crackled softly as he turned them, images unfolding of a life he barely recognized now. Mira laughing in the early days, hair loose, eyes bright. Leo as a baby, impossibly small, curled against Zariq's chest. Then a photo near the middle stopped him entirely. The three of them stood together, sunlight spilling over their faces, smiles unguarded, genuine. Zariq stared at the image, his throat tightening, his chest aching as recognition settled in. That warmth, that ease, that quiet fullness. He had once carried it without effort. He hadn't lost it slowly. He had set it aside. The house remained silent around him as he sat there, the album open on his lap, the past staring back with unbearable clarity. What remained now was only an echo of the man he had been, hollow and unconvincing, and for the first time, Zariq wondered if the foundation he had built his life upon had been flawed long before it finally collapsed. 5. The night after discovering the photograph did not end when Zariq closed the album. It lingered, clung to him like a thin layer of dust that refused to be brushed away. Even when he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling of the master bedroom that felt far too large for a single body, his mind replayed the image relentlessly. Mira's soft smile, Leo's small hand wrapped around his finger, and his own face frozen in a moment when warmth had still lived inside him. Sleep came only in fragments, breaking apart under the weight of thoughts he had avoided for years, and when dawn finally crept through the curtains, it brought no relief, only clarity sharp enough to hurt. He woke with an unfamiliar heaviness in his chest, not the stress of deadlines or structural failures, but something quieter and more invasive. It felt as though a small object had lodged itself behind his ribs, pressing inward with every breath. As he moved through the house, preparing coffee he barely tasted, his eyes drifted repeatedly toward the kitchen counter, toward the memory of that single unlit candle and the small river stone placed beside it with careful intent. The realization that he had stepped over it without pausing now replayed with cruel precision, each recollection sharpening his sense of failure. By mid-morning, the pressure became unbearable. He found himself unable to focus on blueprints spread across his desk, the lines blurring as his thoughts returned again and again to Leo's small hands, to the way his son used to collect stones, not because they were valuable, but because they were unique. Leo had always believed that uniqueness mattered, that rarity held meaning. Zariq pushed his chair back abruptly, the sound echoing in the empty office, and left without explanation, ignoring the surprised glances of his colleagues. For the first time in years, work did not feel important enough to anchor him. The drive home was silent. No music, no calls, no distractions. The city passed by in muted tones, and Zariq barely noticed the familiar streets. His mind was elsewhere, reconstructing a memory he had once dismissed. Leo standing quietly, waiting. Leo offering something small with the seriousness of a child who believes he has found treasure. Zariq's indifference replayed again and again, now stripped of its former justifications. He had not been busy. He had been absent. When he reached the house, the silence felt heavier than before. He went straight to his study, bypassing rooms filled with echoes of what used to be. The drawer resisted slightly as he pulled it open, as if even the furniture had learned to hold on to the past. Inside, among outdated keys and forgotten tools, lay the stone, small, smooth, gray, ordinary to anyone who didn't know its story. He lifted it slowly, reverently, as though afraid that haste might erase something fragile. The stone rested in his palm with unexpected density, cool against his skin, grounding in a way no polished material ever had. Its surface bore subtle marks, tiny imperfections shaped by water and time, and suddenly Zariq understood something profound. This stone had endured pressure without breaking, had traveled far before arriving in his son's hand. It had already lived a journey long before Leo had chosen it. Holding it triggered memories he had suppressed. Leo crouched near streams, sleeves rolled up, shoes soaked, eyes bright with discovery. Mira standing nearby, reminding him gently to be careful, smiling as though she understood the importance of these small rituals. Zariq's throat tightened as he realized how many moments like these he had missed, how often he had chosen distance over presence. The geologist's office felt strangely foreign, yet grounding, like stepping into a world governed by patience rather than urgency. Zariq placed the stone on the counter with deliberate care, as though presenting evidence in a trial where he already feared the verdict. The geologist's examination was unhurried, methodical, and the silence stretched long enough for regret to seep deeper into Zariq's bones. When the man spoke, his words landed with devastating clarity. This was not a random stone. This was rare. This was significant. This had come from a place that demanded effort, risk, and determination. Blackwater Cove. Treacherous, isolated, dangerous even for adults. The room seemed to tilt as understanding struck. Leo had not stumbled upon this gift casually. He had sought it. He had endured fear, scraped skin, uncertainty, all fueled by a child's unwavering belief that his father would see its value. The stone in Zariq's hand transformed instantly, its weight multiplying not physically, but emotionally, pressing down on him with crushing force. The drive back felt longer than the drive there. Every mile echoed with questions Zariq could no longer silence. How long had Leo planned this? How many times had he imagined his father's reaction? How many hopes had been folded neatly into that small, smooth surface? By the time Zariq reached home again, his hands were trembling slightly, the stone resting heavily in his palm as if refusing to be set down. He sat at the kitchen table, alone. The same place where Mira once left notes and Leo once did homework. The stone lay between his hands, unassuming and devastating. Zariq had designed buildings that could withstand earthquakes, yet here he was, undone by something that fit easily into a child's pocket. He stared at it, seeing not mineral composition or geological rarity, but a silent question that had gone unanswered. The realization settled slowly, painfully. This stone was never meant to impress. It was meant to connect. It was Leo reaching across the growing distance, offering proof that he still believed his father was worth the effort. Zariq closed his eyes, his chest tightening as the truth finally settled in its entirety. He had not just ignored a gift, he had ignored a call for love. His phone vibrated on the table, breaking the silence, but he did not reach for it. Not yet. His gaze remained fixed on the stone, his reflection faint and distorted in its surface, mirroring the man he had become. Somewhere beyond these walls, Mira and Leo were living without him, learning how to fill the spaces he had abandoned. Zariq curled his fingers slowly around the stone, his grip firm, resolute. For the first time, the path ahead did not look like a blueprint waiting to be perfected, but a journey he might not be prepared for. Blackwater Cove was no longer a distant place. It was a threshold, a test, and perhaps his last chance to understand what he had almost lost. And as the silence of the house pressed in around him once more, Zariq realized with aching clarity that some foundations could only be repaired by walking back through the very distance you once ignored. 6. The weight of the stone still pressed into Zariq's palm as he climbed into his car. It was no longer just a piece of rock. It was a symbol, a measure of what he had ignored, what he had failed to see, and now, what he could no longer avoid. His hands gripped the steering wheel with a strange mixture of determination and hesitation. Knuckles white, heart hammering against his ribs as if trying to escape. Every red light, every stop sign felt like a test, a chance to pause and reconsider. But he couldn't. He had imagined this drive countless times in fragmented thoughts, retracing the imagined paths Leo might have taken, and now he had to see it for himself, face the consequences of his absence in the flesh. The drive to Blackwater Cove was longer than he had anticipated. The city gradually gave way to rolling hills and narrow roads, the air changing in texture, becoming heavier with the scent of pine, salt, and wet earth. Each mile added pressure to his chest, a rhythm that matched the tightening in his throat. He avoided radio stations, silence his only companion, except for the faint jangle of the stone in his pocket when he adjusted his hand. It seemed to vibrate with purpose, a pulse reminding him he was approaching the life he had ignored, a life that had grown resilient without him. Hours passed, signs warning of steep drops, jagged rocks, and narrow passages became more frequent. He slowed instinctively, recalling the stories of Blackwater Cove's treacherous terrain, the way the paths could betray even experienced hikers. And yet, his mind was not on danger for himself, but on imagining Leo, small, determined, navigating these same paths, hands scraped, shoes muddied, heart set on bringing something back for a father who had barely noticed. That thought made the air in the car seem heavier, as if the weight of years of neglect had joined him on the seat beside him. Eventually, the dense forest thinned, giving way to a small coastal town, its streets narrow and uneven, lined with old brick facades and the scent of fresh bread and roasted coffee. Zariq parked a few blocks away, his heart stuttering. He did not know exactly what he expected to see: apologetic smiles, distant curiosity, or maybe just a life frozen in time. But the moment he spotted Mira's quaint house, he realized he was unprepared. The garden was vibrant, alive with flowers in full bloom, each petal catching sunlight as though to mock his absence. A small vegetable patch grew neatly in one corner, tomatoes heavy on the vine, herbs fragrant and untamed. Life had flourished here without his interference, without his hands or his approval. Zariq crouched behind the hedge, keeping himself hidden, trying not to breathe too loudly. Mira was outside, her hair loosely pinned, the faint scent of something floral drifting toward him, carried on the light breeze. She was laughing, soft, unguarded, the kind of laughter that no longer had to compete with a man's distractions. She spoke animatedly with a local baker, gestures light, hands expressive, her face relaxed in ways that made Zariq's chest ache. He saw her eyes crinkle, a smile that had once been reserved for him now freely given to another, and he realized, painfully, that the warmth he had once taken for granted had not withered. It had simply moved beyond his reach. And then there was Leo. The boy, 10 now but grown in ways Zariq had not witnessed, was crouched near a small mound of dirt, fingers smeared with mud, intent on building what looked like a complex fort from sticks, stones, and whatever scraps the garden provided. His face was alight with joy, eyes wide and sparkling, full of laughter that rose and fell naturally, unprompted, unmeasured. Zariq felt his throat tighten, the familiar catch of guilt settling in. He had seen children play before, of course, but never like this. Not in this moment, not in the raw, exuberant freedom of discovery and creation, of life being shaped by tiny hands without fear, without hesitation. For a long moment, Zariq simply watched, rooted to the spot. He could feel the heartbeat of the house from where he crouched behind the hedge, the rhythmic pulse of life that had continued without him. Every step Leo took, every careful placement of a twig in his fort, every smile that escaped without permission, was a reminder of what he had missed. And he realized with a sudden, crushing clarity that this joy, this unbroken, unfiltered joy, was something he could no longer manufacture, no matter how much he tried, no matter how much he offered gifts or apologies. He was about to step forward. He imagined calling out Leo's name, kneeling beside him, bending to wipe the mud from tiny fingers, wrapping him in a hug and promising, in words, what he had failed to show in actions. He imagined Mira's face turning toward him, her eyes searching for sincerity, and perhaps granting it, perhaps not. He imagined the sound of their voices, the reunion he had long fantasized about during nights of regret, but reality hit him before his first step could even form. Mira leaned toward Leo, a gentle gesture so ordinary yet infinitely powerful. Her hand brushed his cheek, smudging away dirt, lingering for a heartbeat. The smallest of touches, the briefest of reassurances, but it carried a weight Zariq had never learned to measure. It was love, pure and unexamined, a quiet act of tenderness. And in that instant, Zariq froze. His own presence would not bring light into this scene, it would fracture it. He understood now that appearances were not enough, that apologies could not replace years of absence, that his intrusion could undo the careful harmony they had built. The stone in his pocket seemed heavier than ever, as if absorbing the gravity of the moment. Zariq pressed it to his palm, closing his fingers over it. It felt like a tether to what he had lost, to the desperate hope of a child, to the resilience of a mother who had chosen to protect what was most precious. His breathing became shallow, measured, almost imperceptible, as if he could somehow vanish into the shadows and become only an observer rather than a threat. He took a step back, then another, his body moving against the instinct to rush forward, because some truths were not meant to be acted on impulsively. He stayed there for hours, unnoticed, watching the sunlight shift across the garden, casting patterns on the ground where Leo ran and Mira moved. Hearing their laughter, the gentle click of gardening tools, the distant caw of gulls overhead, every sound seemed magnified, each movement a vivid reminder of the life that had continued, of the bond that had been nurtured in his absence, and of the silent, profound cost of his neglect. He understood, finally, that some connections could not be forced, could not be claimed with excuses or remorse. They had to be earned, carefully, deliberately, from the margins. As dusk approached, shadows stretching long over the garden, Zariq finally turned away. The ache in his chest was not lighter, but it had clarity. He had seen what he had been blind to, understood the depth of what he had overlooked. Mira and Leo had not only survived, they had thrived. He had not been the architect of their joy, and stepping into that space now would only risk dismantling the fragile equilibrium they had fought to create. And yet, even as he drove away, his eyes fixed on the retreating view of the quaint house and vibrant garden, the stone in his pocket felt alive, a pulse beneath his palm, reminding him that observation was not surrender, and that one day, perhaps, there might be a way to rebuild, not the past, but a future measured in attentiveness, in presence, in the quiet, patient work of reconnecting without destroying. 7. Zariq's car rumbled along the familiar roads leading away from the small town, the weight of what he had witnessed at Mira and Leo's house pressing down on him like a physical force. The sun was low, spilling gold over the landscape, but its warmth offered no comfort, only a harsh reminder of the light he had so carelessly ignored. The stone in his pocket was cold now, smoothed by years of handling and small regrets, yet it seemed to vibrate faintly, echoing the pulse of a heartbeat that was no longer entirely his own. For the first time, he understood the magnitude of absence, not just of being physically away, but the slow erosion that neglect could carve into the hearts of those who had once trusted him completely. He had failed, yes, but the clarity of failure was also strangely liberating. He did not need to chase Mira or Leo. He needed to rebuild quietly from the ruins of his own mistakes. He returned to the house he had once filled with grandeur, light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows that now looked like mirrors of his own solitude. Each room bore the ghosts of laughter, arguments, and forgotten mornings, the faint scent of coffee and flowers mingling with the lingering echoes of steps that no longer existed. Zariq walked through the hallways slowly, almost reverently, his fingers brushing against walls that had witnessed his hubris, his absence, and the slow, steady decay of intimacy. He did not rage, did not curse the silence. He merely understood it. The house was no longer his in every sense that truly mattered. He asked Sloane to leave that evening, not with confrontation, not with anger, but with the quiet, devastating clarity of someone who had finally accepted the magnitude of his own errors. She packed her belongings, her laughter tinged with resignation, and left. Zariq stood in the doorway long after the car had disappeared down the street, the emptiness settling into him with a weight that was equal parts penance and awakening. The grand house did not long survive in his possession. Its sale was less a financial decision than an act of release, a symbolic shedding of the past he could no longer inhabit without crumbling. Zariq watched the new owners take possession with a strange detachment, their voices and footsteps alive with energy he no longer needed to share. He left the neighborhood behind carrying only a suitcase, the stone, and a lingering ache that would not fade. A year passed in a quiet rhythm he had never known before. Zariq found himself inhabiting a modest apartment, walls painted in muted tones, sunlight streaming in through curtains that moved lazily with the wind. The space was simple, functional, but it had room for life. He filled it with books on horticulture, studying soil types, water cycles, and the subtle ways plants communicated with light. Mira's influence was everywhere in his small attempts at greenery, her touch haunting every leaf, every seedling he nurtured. He learned patience not from architecture, but from watching sprouts unfurl slowly in the sun, from waiting for leaves to reach toward him as if acknowledging his care. Time moved differently here. Zariq volunteered at a local community center, designing small parks, playgrounds, and spaces for children to explore safely. He studied patterns of movement, the way laughter echoed, the scent of grass and earth mixing with sunscreen and joy. Every bench he placed, every tree he positioned was a quiet homage to a family he had lost, and yet in the process of giving to others, he discovered a fragile satisfaction. The work was far removed from towering skyscrapers or glass and steel marvels. These projects required nurturing, attention to small details, and respect for growth rather than control. Qualities Mira had always embodied and he had long neglected. But his heart never sought direct contact with Mira or Leo. He understood now that his presence, untimely or uninvited, would be more harmful than healing. Instead, he created a ritual of small, indirect gestures. Every few months, he wrote a letter and mailed it to a P.O. box he knew Mira still checked. These letters were not pleas for forgiveness, nor attempts to reclaim the life he had lost. They were maps, guides, and faintly whispered connections across the distance that he had once widened with neglect. Each envelope was sealed with care, the handwriting deliberate, careful, a reflection of a father learning to measure weight and space not through buildings, but through intention. One evening, as twilight bled into the sky, Zariq sat at his small kitchen table, candlelight flickering softly against the walls. He traced a map onto fine paper, lines drawn carefully, deliberately. This map did not chart streets or buildings, but stars. He recalled Leo's fascination with glow-in-the-dark constellations, the soft light above the boy's bed, and he imagined him still lying awake, tracing imaginary lines with his small fingers. He wrote slowly, his pen hesitating over each word, aware of the gravity of his voice. "My dearest Leo," it began, and he paused, feeling the weight of his own absence. Each word carried a tremor of hope, of longing, but also restraint. He did not wish to intrude. He only wished to share. "I've been thinking about Blackwater Cove and the Star Heart basalt. I finally went there, and it was even more beautiful than you described. I also started studying constellations. Remember how you loved those glow-in-the-dark stars on your ceiling? There's a particular cluster, the Lost Child's Whisper. It's visible in late autumn. I've drawn a small map showing you where I've seen it from my window." His hand paused. Each line, each star carefully plotted became a meditation. He imagined Leo's small face, how the boy might tilt his head, squinting through night skies, fingers tracing the path he had drawn. He hoped the boy would see it not as a reminder of absence, but as a quiet signal. "I am watching from a distance, without demanding, without intruding." This isn't an invitation, son. It's just information. A new kind of blueprint, maybe. I've been learning to draw the light, not just the shadows. And I hope one day, if you ever look up at the same sky, you might see a little less darkness than before. The pen trembled slightly in his hand, the letter a fragile bridge spanning the distance of years. Zariq understood now that some reconnections had to be built slowly, with patience and a respect for autonomy and growth. He sealed the envelope, sliding the map inside with a tenderness he had long reserved for architectural drafts and stone specimens, realizing that this time he was designing not for a client or a skyline, but for a son, a child who had once reached for him in faith. The walk to the mailbox was slow, deliberate, the evening air cool and faintly scented with rain yet to fall. The envelope felt heavier than any blueprint he had ever carried, yet somehow lighter than his own expectations. He placed it carefully in the slot, a final act of acknowledgement, a quiet promise without fanfare. He did not expect a reply, did not anticipate a reunion. He only hoped that somewhere, in the darkness of a child's bedroom or the quiet of a night sky, his small gesture would be seen, understood, perhaps treasured. As he turned toward the apartment, he paused, looking up. The sky had deepened into a tapestry of indigo, stars glimmering faintly, distant and unclaimed. Zariq's gaze traced the constellations, searching for the cluster he had drawn. His chest swelled with something he had not felt in years. Connection, not control, not construction, not possession, but connection. The fragile, trembling bridge between past neglect and future presence. And in that moment, he understood the ultimate lesson. True value is not something you take, demand, or construct. It is something you nurture, patiently, attentively, in silence when no one is watching, and in hope when the world offers only absence. He exhaled slowly, the sound swallowed by the night. His eyes lingered on the same sky Leo might one day trace. For the first time in years, Zariq felt his chest lighten, the weight of regret tempered by a small, quiet hope. And though he did not know if Leo would ever see the letter or the map, he allowed himself to believe in the possibility of light, of paths that could be rebuilt, of stars that could guide them both toward understanding, even across the distance. The night was still, the world held its breath, and Zariq finally stepped inside, carrying neither guilt nor grand designs, only the quiet knowledge that sometimes the smallest gestures, like a carefully drawn map, a rare stone, a letter of intent, could echo further than any tower ever built. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope this story touched your heart as much as it touched mine while creating it. Remember, every choice we make shapes the lives of those we love, and sometimes the smallest gestures can carry the biggest weight. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What part of the story moved you the most? Drop your comments below and let's start a conversation. Don't forget to subscribe to Heartwoven Tales for more stories full of emotion, love, and life's unexpected twists. Until next time, keep your hearts open, and remember, the connections we nurture today can shine far longer than we ever imagined.